Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank. I'm here with Miles. Miles, for everyone out there listening, you have a very big kind of a wide range of things that we could talk about. But if you want to introduce yourself to everyone out there listening.
Sure. My name is Miles Pomper. I'm a senior fellow at, this is a very long organizational name. It's called the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. So that's a mouthful.
If I just told you that it cut out right there and you had to repeat it again, that would be awful.
Yeah. So I work on, my background is in sort of, foreign policy and journalism. And I work at a think tank that focuses on controlling weapons of mass destruction, that is nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. And I focus primarily on nuclear weapons, but also nuclear energy, which has some relation, and other aspects that are kind of in that zone.
Now, this might throw us off into a weird rabbit hole, but people talk about nuclear weapons, especially right now with the war that's going on. Is that, do you even have a fear of that, like that's going to get tossed to that point? Or is it, because I feel like after the first one went off, it just seemed like that was always a fear. You hear it get mentioned all the time whenever we go to war. People go, "Oh, they're going to drop nukes," or it's a reference that gets tossed out like that or something like that. I don't necessarily consider it that big of a fear on people using it, because I feel like that's like a last thing, because I think they all realize the damage it does. But do you think it has maybe more of an implication?
Well, I agree with you. It's not going to be the first thing people resort to, but I mean, we've clearly seen in this case, Putin's been using Russia's nuclear capability as a shield to keep his forces protected from NATO's NATO response, NATO intervention. So it has an effect, even if you don't physically use the weapons. We have kept restrained ourselves from doing a lot of things because we don't want to provoke an escalation to a nuclear level conflict. So, in some, the Strategic Command in the U.S. likes to say we use nuclear weapons every day, and in a sense they do, because they deter a number of potential attacks and other incidents that would occur in the absence of nuclear weapons. So I guess I would use it that way.
Do you think that maybe a large fear from it probably comes from an aspect of a lot of people don't know too much about it? Like when I look up, which I kind of reached out to you for, like I told you off air, was that about nuclear energy. Now, if you look up nuclear energy, energy.gov will tell you it's the right way to go. And I'm kind of out here trying to sort it out for myself about what's going on. I've heard even climate scientists talk about how it's a more beneficial thing that we could be going towards. But I think a lot of people just have a fear from it. Mostly, like when I think of it, I think of growing a third arm on your head or something. But I think a lot of people talk about like
the Simpsons episodes.
Yeah. But people bring up like Chernobyl or an incident like that. And I think that also comes from just not managing them. Like a lot of nuclear reactors, like we don't really, maintenance on those things. They always talk about an isolation incident or something like that, where something melts down and they don't want a Chernobyl to happen. If it is a more effective way, I just wonder, could it be done properly? I think people have a bad kind of take on nuclear weapons. Maybe it is bad, but at the same time, there's not a lot of education on it. I mean, there's more of a fear aspect when it gets mentioned. It's kind of like a threat. Like when you see the bully, like, I'm going to punch you in the groin. And that's like the last like ditch effort in a sense. You know what I mean?
Well, I'd say, we have to be careful to try to separate two things. One is nuclear weapons and the other is nuclear energy, at least when we talk about it. Now, the fact is that nuclear weapons were the first thing that was developed, and then peaceful nuclear energy kind of came after that. So there is a link historically, and also in sort of practice. I mean, there's parts, nuclear technology can be used for both purposes. But I think there also is, as you said, kind of a lot of public confusion and fear that all nuclear energy suddenly becomes nuclear weapons, and it's disastrous. Uh, and so part of it is that people have to, we encounter risks every day with every form of energy. I mean, you have a natural gas plant. Well, a pipeline could explode and you could hurt people, right? Obviously, climate change has its own impacts on people's lives and risks. So in all these cases, you're doing trade-offs. Is the risk worth the benefit that you're getting, and what are your alternatives? Um, in terms of nuclear energy and climate change, uh, it is clear that nuclear energy is a low carbon form of energy, so that's clearly to its benefit as opposed to fossil fuels. Um, and It also provides baseload power, which means that it's a power that's available around the clock, which is not the case of, say, solar power or wind power, which are only available, at least absent batteries, when the sun shines or the wind blows. So that's kind of the strongest case, I think, for nuclear power, is that base load, low carbon power. Uh, the problem is, there's a number of shortcomings to nuclear power as well. The first is that generally it's very expensive. It's not economic in most places. And the US, which is a relatively free market when it comes to which form of energy is used, uh, nuclear power is not making the, is kind of failing the test economically. There's actually only one nuclear plant under construction in the US, and that's in Georgia. And the Southeast US has different regulations compared to the rest of the country that favor nuclear power. For one thing, they allow utilities to charge customers for the nuclear plant while it's being built before it even provides any electricity. And so they've kind of got a very unusual environment, and even they are having a lot of problems. Nuclear power plants tend to run way over budget. They're very complicated. They run into the billions of dollars. Estimates of costs are always under what they actually end up being. And the other problem is that nuclear plants take a very long time to build. So you're talking about somewhere between 5-6 years and a decade. And what that means is, while the plant is being built, uh, you have to pay for all the workers and everything else that take to make it happen. You're talking billions of dollars, so you have to borrow the money, and so you have huge finance charges, which can be okay if your interest rates are pretty low. But if your interest rates rise, which we're starting to see in the United States, then it becomes a lot less economically viable. And it's sort of little known, but nuclear power in the United States kind of was hitting its high point in 1970s, and then we had the 3 Mile Island incident. And while that incident had an effect on the nuclear power industry in and of itself, the bigger effect was that interest rates at that time went way up for other reasons. And it was like 15%, 16%. And so the nuclear power industry collapsed in the United States, and it's never recovered since then, partly because we had Chernobyl and everything a few years later. And so um, economics is the real problem when it comes to nuclear power. It's just not economical in a free market.
Do you think with enough research that maybe it would be more economical in a sense? Like it seems like whenever we talk, like, because if your focus is mainly on nuclear weapons or in that whole entire trade policy on that aspect of stuff, we can get to that. I'm just curious about the nuclear thing in general, because I think you have a more rational perspective on just the word nuclear in the first place. Because if you mention that to the general public, people think like extreme scenarios when it comes to it, always gets related to war. But if you bring it up about energy, people talk about it relates to Chernobyl. But I'm like, research wise, if is it a political issue that's why it's been mismanaged so much? Because if they're telling you it's good, but it also seems like they're not, like whenever someone says like, okay, climate change is happening. All right, we all know that. But how do we fix it? not you don't get a lot of answers. And if you do, everyone's got like, well, we can do this, but it's like, okay, well, why aren't we doing that then? Well, it's not this and it's not this. And he goes, yeah, but if we focus on it now, would it be more sustainable? Like eventually you get all the nuclear power plants built. It's kind of like electric cars, like the push for that is it's going to cost a lot of carbon emissions to be able to produce the gas, whatever the lines to make the electrical stuff to put in the cars. But then you'll eventually see the shift happen when more people are driving electric cars and you're not building them anymore. You'll see it slowly start to decrease when it comes to pollution wise. So I just look at it like, is it a time thing, or is it just, are we just worried about like what's coming up right in front of us rather than what's going to be down the road?
Well, I think there's a few things. I mean, partly it's a, you know, as someone used to say, it's a nuclear power is a very complicated way to boil water, which is essentially what you're doing. I mean, what you do with a nuclear power plant is you produce steam that turns a turbine that generates electricity. There's a lot of more simple ways to boil water than coming up with nuclear fission. Um, and we haven't solved, real problems like nuclear waste and spent fuel from the nuclear plants. The U.S. has not agreed on a, Yucca Mountain, which is where we were supposed to put our nuclear waste, and spent fuel is not opened. So, it's kind of like we've built a lot of houses without any bathrooms. There's, it's kind of backwards. I mean, we should be figuring out what we're going to do with the waste before we build more plants. And we haven't done that yet. And there's a big political problem in that because no state wants to be the state that's hosting the nuclear waste and the
Yeah.
nuclear spent fuel. And so, that's where the politics is in more than anything. There is efforts in the United States and other countries around the world to build what are called small and modular reactors. These are called and the acronym is SMRs. And you've got a lot of, entrepreneurs like Bill Gates is involved in this, and a whole bunch of people who are sort of, some Silicon Valley people and
He's
so on.
involved in everything, dude. I'm
Yeah.
telling you.
um, and they're trying to tackle some of the problems which have led to the high cost of nuclear power, which is that every nuclear plant, for instance, is kind of one of a kind and has to be sort of built on the site, and it's usually expensive. So the modular part is that you could build a lot of the parts in factories, and they could be sort of, like Legos or something. You could
Yeah.
sort of put them together. And they would also be smaller, which meant that you didn't have to, spend billions of dollars on the plant. You might be able to spend hundreds of millions, which might be more easier from a finance point of view and a timeline and all those kind of things. But we're still in the stage where all of that is just paper designs right now. No one has actually built a commercial reactor in the United States. They're all going through the licensing process. I mean, the first NuScale, which is a company in Oregon, which is kind of the leader in this, I think they're kind of anticipating maybe they'll have a reactor built in 2024, 2025 in Idaho, like a kind of test prototype reactor. But these licensing processes take a very long time, and the construction takes a very long time. So if you're trying to have an impact on climate change, you're talking, it's a decade before you'll see any kind of impact on that. So it's kind of there are people, very smart people in terms of technology trying to do it, but ultimately the challenge is the cost. Until you can make that affordable, you could come up with all sorts of nifty technology. But if you can't make it affordable, yeah, Bitcoin. But it's even like the electric cars, right? Too. I mean, and some of those. I mean, obviously, Elon Musk has done that to some extent with Tesla, but that's also been like a very high demographic, right? I mean, you're not talking, mom and pop who go buy the sort of average car. So can you get these things at a price that makes sense for utilities, which have to operate basically in a free market environment, to buy those rather than natural gas plants, which generally in the US, at least until recently, we had fracking, we had everything else. Natural gas was quite inexpensive. And in fact, with nuclear power, it's kind of interesting economics because, as I was saying, it's very expensive to build a nuclear power plant. And almost unlike other forms of energy, most of the cost in operating a nuclear power plant is upfront. It's in the construction. Once you've built the plant, operating it is not very expensive, because uranium fuel is actually fairly cheap. You have a certain number of workers, but actually not that many workers, because uh, these are pretty automated processes to a
Yeah.
certain extent. And so the economics of nuclear power is, the longer you can run a nuclear power plant, the better, because generally, you can amortize the costs over more time. And so the cost per year declines. And so what's the biggest thing that's happened in a lot of ways in the nuclear industry in the last few decades has been extending the lifetime of operating reactors. So we started out with a 30-year reactor, 30-year operating life, then it went to 40. Now we've got some that are going to 60, and there's even some people who want to go to 80 years. And the question is, can you do that safely? For a number of reasons, including parts wear out and radiation affects things. And can you do it just like having a car? After a while, when you've had a car for a number of years, it's the same kind of situation. You're better off keeping it, but when you start having to replace your parts really often, then it stops being economic to use car. And some of the nuclear power plants are in that kind of situation. And so even though generally it's better to run the plants essentially forever, or as long as you can get away with it, we've had a number of plants in the US close before the end of their license time because they just weren't economic compared to gas plants. And so we still have the world's largest nuclear energy fleet in the United States, but it's declined. And that's because we're not building new plants. A lot of plants are reaching the natural end of their lifetime, and even some are ending before then. So, if the nuclear industry is lucky, we'll stay at a steady state in the United States. But the prognosis is that they'll actually have fewer plants in a few years.
What would you say would be probably the best method if we're talking about climate change and just using a better energy thing? Would you say nuclear? Because, like, I don't know, the answer, it seems like the way you're explaining it, it seems like you're interested in nuclear, but at the same time, like for me, I'm right now, I think it's just fossil fuels. I don't think we're at a point where we can start suggesting other methods. I don't think electricity is the way to go. I don't think air is the way to go. I don't think solar is the way to go. I don't think water is the way to go. Nuclear, I've seen say it's been the best option, but the points you bring up about economics and all that as well too. And I can't get over the oversight of people. Whether it's automated or not, most things you still have to have people maintenance those automated parts as well too. And people are lazy as shit, man. I hate to say that, like, but I don't expect them to be like, oh, we're supposed to manage them every 30 years. Every coal power plant's way past due when it's supposed to be maintenance. And I go, what's going to stop them from doing the same thing with something even more dangerous in a sense when it comes to just destroying an area? But man, I don't know. Like I said, I got interested in the climate topic because I had a couple people on that people would say were controversial. And so I needed to get more understanding of this topic in general. So I'm just curious what you think will be maybe a more manageable or more effective way. Because whenever you hear someone say their side or their point, they never talk about what they can do to fix it. They just say we have a climate issue. And I'm like, I get that, but where do we go? Because we can sit here and have an issue all day, but we're all going to end up with our pants down at some point.
Well, I mean, an economist would tell you we shouldn't choose it by the technology. If we have a problem, we should put a tax on the thing that we want to have less of. So you put on a carbon tax of some kind, and then the free market will sort out what makes sense.
Gas is almost $6.
Right. So people will start moving towards electric vehicles, as you're already seeing. So I mean, that's what happens in a free market. People move away from the thing that's not effective.
I got called a conspiracy person for saying that. You know that? I was like, dude, that's not a conspiracy. That's just common sense, man. You're trying to phase out. You tell me they got an electric car bill coming out, and then suddenly gas prices go up. Oh, it's because of Russia. Bullshit.
Well, we'll leave aside the origins, but that's that's the way kind of the world. That's how you incentivize people. How do you stop people from smoking? You raise the huge amounts of taxes on cigarettes, right? I mean, that had a lot to do with it. And so, that would be to me, that's the solution. You don't pick, you let lots of people experiment, figure out what they can do, but they'll figure it. Companies and businessmen and entrepreneurs are very smart, and they'll work hard and come up with the ideas. It's not government's not particularly good at figuring those things out. So, um, and I think, uh, I think nuclear is part of the mix. I think the these SMRs, try and have them go forward, have people try to develop them, see what happens. I think the more important thing is really the keeping the existing plants operating, because, as I said, I mean, these, for one thing, they produce a lot more electricity than these other plants, so you're getting more bang for the buck, and um, they're already there, so it's not something that's going to take 10 years to get it done.
Yeah. I always thought like, why don't we just regulate it like per state? Like I know everyone's kind of trying to get on the same page, but you're not going to get China and all the other countries to fall in line with what you want to do. Like if we do electric cars, China doesn't care. They're going to do whatever they've been doing, whether they're doing electric or not. I just look at it from a state basis. Some places are going to be doing better with solar energy because they're mostly in the sun, or they mostly like Seattle's not going to be able to do solar panels. It rains every day there. Like they're going to have to find some other type of method, whether it's wind power or something, to be able to function. So regulate it by state, but then people go, no, we need a global fix all one answer. You can't have everybody doing their own thing. I mean, it's which do you find that like, okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I agree with you basically. I mean, I think, well, at a regulatory level, they are primarily regulated by states in terms of, say, nuclear power and how you charge for it, and that's done by state level. It's not done at the federal level. In terms of, the global, you want to have some kind of global agreement to have, whether it's, climate change or Paris Accord, but it's going to be sort of, you don't want someone to get like to benefit from everyone else trying to deal with climate change and they get off by doing nothing, right? So that's kind of why you want a global agreement, but you're never going to get, that's going to be sort of least common denominator. That's going to be very basic. You're not going to really tackle the problem. It's just to try to get everyone not having a conflict.
Yeah.
And at the federal level, the federal level is good for certain things. I think especially for R&D, because states really can't do that. So, and we've got national labs, like a national renewable laboratory in Colorado and things like that. So they can fund these big kind of basic science R&D kind of things that helps the private sector. But it's not, states aren't going to really do that. State role is on sort of the regulatory price level of, do we get this? Is it oil or is it gas or is it coal or is it nuclear power? I mean, states are already doing that, and they can, California, for instance, is kind of well known as kind of a lead, taking a lead role or a kind of getting ahead of everyone else on some of this stuff. And that has an advantage. They can experiment with things and then they can screw it up or not screw it up, and the rest of the country can learn from them.
When that comes
Yeah,
up, well, I was gonna switch over to the one I probably think you're more interested in, which is the weapon aspect of it. Would you say you're more interested in that, or probably more? It seems like that would be your main thing of focus.
Well, that's what I tend to get paid for, but I mean, the energy I'm interested in it too, because I think there's, it's an interesting, I mean, just the politics of it and the economics, and there's a lot of different
Well, it's
aspects.
it's the one I could probably speak on the most. Sadly, if I bring it over to the weapons topic, you're probably gonna be doing most of the talking, because I just I don't I haven't interested into that much of our war. I mean, at first everyone thought that there's weapons of mass destruction is always what I know about, just because that was in my childhood, was hearing about Iraq and all that type of stuff too. But when it comes to nuclear war, just weapon conflicts, what specific things do you find that you could be able to educate myself in, which it could be honestly anything. You could tell me that nukes could cure cancer, and I would believe you. But when it comes to just like some serious issues that usually get tossed about, and some maybe everyday topics that you try and focus in, because I mean, surprisingly, you seem like you have a great sense of humor for someone that focuses on a topic where, if you ask the general public, would be a dark subject in some places. Not only on the lack of information, but just the topic in general. I mean, like I know the famous quote when they launched the first one, or they tested the first one, where he was like, "I became death destroyer of worlds," and then I think of Doctor Manhattan. Yeah,
um yeah, Well, I think a lot of people who are in grim professions try to have a sense of humor. I used to be a journalist and cover the police beat, and they had a pretty dark sense of humor on the police side. So
uh,
you sort of have to keep sanity, I think. Yeah.
But when it comes to what you probably focus on, or maybe some topics that rattle around in your head, when it comes to just this area, what for the general public, myself included, what are some interesting things, or maybe some things that we aren't really aware of? Like, I feel like a lot of people are missing key pieces of information when it comes to, you hear about the nuclear threat, you hear about this all the time. Is it that big of a scale, or is this also a factor of the media as well too? I get it's a fear. We need to worry about someone launching a nuke because that could happen if someone just gets pissed off. But is that always at the cusp of it when it comes to how the media portrays it?
Well, I'll leave aside how the media portrays it exactly for a second, because there's different media and different people do it differently. But I think it's, you know, nuclear is kind of like pandemics, right? I mean, it's one of these high consequence, low probability events, a nuclear war. So, and knock on wood, we haven't had any nuclear attacks and since the Japanese bombings in the 40s, and hopefully we'll never have one again. But if it happens, it's going to be really bad.
Yeah.
So, the question is, how do you make it less likely, and what are the ways you can do that? So, I work on things like arms control, which are basically designed for that, enhance kind of predictability and transparency, so that we know what more about, particularly the Russians, and they know more about us, and we um, have some, we don't get surprised. I mean, and have someone, and we don't misinterpret something that's happening as beginning of the nuclear attack, or because then that sets in place a kind of vicious cycle that we all have to worry about. And so that's, I think, the most important, is the more we can enhance the predictability. It's more, people tend to focus on, oh, there's an arms control treaty and they cut the numbers. The numbers are, one is enough to ruin your day, right? So you don't have to, whether it's 100 or 200 or 300 is not the real question. The real question is, let's make it less likely that any go off, and let's try to, have enough transparency and predictability to either, to lessen the chances will happen, lessen the chances that other conflicts will spread. And I think, the administration, for instance, in Ukraine, I think has been doing a good job of kind of messaging so that we don't get into situations where the Russians think we're going to do something that's going to make them want to use a nuclear weapon. And they're very careful about that. And there's a reason, there are these risks that things could escalate and get out of hand. And when countries have nuclear weapons, you got to be very careful about that. So I think that's, that's the message I try to give to people. It's like, you need to keep, you have to have caution and a certain amount of fear, because really bad things could happen if things go wrong. But there's a lot of people who are trying to, keep things under control. And so,
That's
rather than panic, work on that.
that's
Panic
that's
doesn't help anyone.
that's just it's so it's just so, for me at least, coming from a way outside perspective and kind of looking at it, it's like people say, well, nuclear war won't happen because we have trade agreements and we have all these or treaties and stuff in place. And it's like, yeah, but you know how like many good days OJ had, and then he had the one bad day. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's all about like how you really rub someone off the wrong way. And when I see like I know people talk about like the world organization where all the nations come together, United Nations, and they're all talking and so that, I'm like, you know how many of those people probably don't like each other and they're just sitting there to smile on TV? Like, we had closed door testimonies with 9/11. We had all this type of stuff because it was serious issues that they needed to fix. That to me, when it comes to like an open display of everyone shaking hands, nice to meet you, all this type of stuff, like let's be friendly. That's the biggest show. And I'm just like, the sensitivity of one person's on a hair trigger. I think that's why Kim Jong-un got so much crap and was all being all over the place, was because he was that hair trigger person that has this kind of a crazy ego in a sense as well too. But I start wondering, it's like, would the world be just completely better if there were there was no invention of it if Oppenheimer never created it in the first place? Because it's so hard, because we use science to strive forward. We use science to create innovations and make amazing things. But what happens if one of those innovations or amazing things happens to be something that's literally going to change the way that we fight, that change the way of going to war? And wars, usually people say we never won a war. Well, there's constantly rumors or stuff like that. Like you were saying, probably a lot of your job has to also do with assuming that what they're giving you isn't the full thing as well, too. There might be some other stuff out there as well, too, because we're doing it too. That's the thing, is that like when people say it'll never happen, I go, why do you say that? Like, people, they're people, and everyone's kind of like Russian troll farms are the biggest example. Like everyone thought that was a conspiracy theory. Then it comes out as like, oh my God, they're actually incentivizing violence on the internet by creating bot accounts. It's like, yeah, we're doing it too. Everyone's doing it. That's the thing, is that you think that person's doing it. They couldn't even be doing it. They might not even thought of it. But now they find out you're doing it. Now they're doing it. And now your rumor that is in your head has now become true. And that's what makes this whole thing where I'm like, I was worried about asteroid impacts hitting this planet and killing us all. Now you got me worried about nuclear threats, where I'm just like, yeah, holy shit. If you have that much power in your hand, dude, have you ever owned a samurai sword? You're pulling it out in the middle of your bedroom, standing on top of your bed because you have power now. Like you're just showing off. Like that's all that is.
On the asteroids, actually, there's all these efforts that they would try to hit the asteroids with nuclear weapons. That's one of the.
They tried to blow up the moon, dude. That's what I'm way back in like the 70s or whatever. They tried to launch a nuke at the moon to test how strong they were. And some person's like, well, that's going to mess up all our research if we try and ever research the moon or about it. And then someone's like, oh, that's true. Maybe we shouldn't do that. That's what I'm saying, is like this thing that has been given to you is like if I gave you brass knuckles, you're going to be like, I can punch someone way harder. Like it's I don't know how to get rid of that though. I don't know how.
You cannot invent it. That's the thing.
Yeah.
So we have to live with it somehow. I mean, even if somehow you manage to, achieve the hopes of nuclear disarmers and everyone actually got rid of all their weapons, which I don't think is likely, but let's say they did that, they still have the knowledge and someone could rebuild them, right? So we sort of have to figure out how to minimize the dangers and the risks. And the other side is, one could argue that nuclear deterrence has at its benefits, which is that we haven't had a world war since Second World War, and that probably has something to do with the major powers having nuclear weapons. I mean, you can see it kind of in Ukraine even, which is that this caution that we have, right, is because we don't want to induce a nuclear war. So that has a certain, conventional wars were pretty awful too in the 20th century. So
it seems like when we talk about media, I know you brought up a really good point. Depending on which media you watch, it's just scary. Even if one is saying nuclear threat imminent or nuclear danger, even if it's not true, you're putting out false information that could lead to someone acting upon that decision, whether it's the common person or whether it's just someone who watches your station who might be higher up in office. See, you just need one person to whisper that thing into someone's ear. I mean, it's really hard unless you're broad screening or screen projecting Nagasaki or Hiroshima into like all those horrible pictures after the devastation of it into people's heads. Like, you see this? Do you want this to happen? Do you want this to happen? Whether it's your country or not, those are innocent people. Because a lot of times you're so pent up on, I don't want this person to do it to me. And that is dude, I don't know how you sleep at night, man. I'm sorry. I'm already freaking losing hair talking about it.
Yeah, there's it, if you, as I said, that's why we have a sense of humor. You have to,
I'd be smoking crack every day. Like, holy crap, dude. I couldn't function with this properly. Like, no. I think
I'm not going to bring that up because I'll never get a security clearance.
So what would be some, I guess, deterrence, I would say, or maybe should it be, because I was going to say it more open access when it comes to just information that we have, but it's very, very, you're not going to have everyone be honest. You're not going to want to have everybody look into the things that you're doing.
I mean, I'd say one other thing. My organization actually does a lot of work. Not me personally, but we have some great folks in my organization that do a lot of this uh, geospatial imaging analysis. So you've probably seen stories in places like the Washington Post, New York Times about, these guys have missiles, those guys have some kind of technology, and a lot of that are my colleagues who are, one amazing thing that's really happened since the end of the Cold War is that ordinary people can now get access to satellite technology that only governments had before. So we can really see what's kind of happening everywhere in the world these days. And smart people who don't have to have security clearances can figure out, okay, that's what that is. That, this is a missile, this is a truck, this is, and so on. And so it's actually, in that sense, we have a much more transparent world than we used to have. And you could see that in Ukraine a lot of times. I mean, a lot of private organizations can, take these pictures of the convoy or whatever it is. It's not just, we don't just have to sort of believe what the government tells us, which is kind of what we had to do in somewhere like Iraq, right? So I think that's been very good for, in terms of, it's not just government, it's kind of ordinary people can have a say in this discussion.
Do you think that it's leading to more research on trying to find another method that's more destructive than a nuclear? And it may be less impactful when it comes to like just completely like land that you're not going to be able to probably go on for 10, 15 years after wherever it hits.
Well, I think we've had in the last, you know, again, largely since the end of the Cold War, we've had not so much that as kind of more we've had precision conventional weapons, right? We've all seen the pictures of in Iraq and other places and of, hitting it through someone's window or whatever, some very precise attack. That's happened to nuclear weapons too. So they've actually become more precise. Not, I mean, before they were very dumb weapons, which was part of the reason they were used, because we didn't have, or were threatened to be used, because we didn't have precise conventional weapons. So if you wanted to be sure you really hit something, you had to like have a nuke, because that could cover like a whole large area. Now that we have these conventional precision weapons, you don't presumably need nuclear weapons for as many military missions. And even those you have, a lot of these are, it's a much more precise weapon. The danger of that is they become so precise and so limited yield that people start thinking, well, a nuke is like just any other weapon, and we can use that instead of a conventional weapon, which is where we have to worry about a little bit now, because even if they're not big yields, they're still nuclear weapons, and that's kind of a psychological threshold you don't want to cross.
Because I heard when Russia said they really did that hypersonic missile. I'm
Right.
looking at it like you would think that like everyone knows the damage that a nuclear weapon can do. And I figured that they would just research something bigger. Like if you see the biggest guy on the block, you want to take him out. So you're the biggest person on the block. So I wonder if there's a lot of research being done to find a less impactful when it comes to our environment and looking towards more of a, I guess, not as, or probably as destructive, I would say. I don't know if I mean, we don't know because it hasn't been done, I think, when it comes to a bigger than a nuke. Yeah, that's just like my mind starts going like I don't know how you manage all this. Like, what are policies that are set in place to be able to handle that effectively, and then expecting everyone to follow by those guidelines?
Well, some of it is, it's not really policies, it's deterrence, as you said. I mean, it's military is doing it. It's not, there's treaties, you try to control some things, but I mean, big as the Russians during the Cold War devastated something called, detonated something called the Tsar Bomba, which is just absolutely enormous nuclear weapon. I was like I don't know, 1.5 megatons or something,
Jesus.
which is what, the Hiroshima bombs are about 15 kilotons. So,
Holy crap.
but they kind of, that was a test, and they didn't, that they don't actually deploy those things because it's not really military useful to have that big a weapon, right? So um, the the hypersonic thing, on the other hand, is kind of, some of that is hype. I mean, I think a lot of the reason the Russians used that weapon was not because it made a lot of military sense or was advantageous. It's because they can show off technology, and that one is kind of good for domestic propaganda. It's good for sort of a little bit of intimidation and prestige in terms of other countries. And unfortunately, wars tend to be kind of like trade conventions for arms sales. So the Russians have used Syria, for instance, as a way to show off all their new weapons so they can sell it to other countries in the Middle East and elsewhere. Some of that might be happening in Ukraine, like, oh, we've got these hypersonic weapons now, don't you want it? And because you can hit these, all the hypersonics do, their main advantage is that they're maneuverable, which means that they can avoid some of the missile defenses and air defenses. But they've been having plenty, they've got some of their things knocked down by air defenses, but they've clearly been able to hit a lot of targets with just traditional ballistic and cruise missiles. So, I think it's much more on these other categories of sort of prestige and domestic propaganda and so on. And given that they're having such a hard time, oh, now we've got hypersonics, now you should really be worried.
Do you think that this is all like it's mostly like a bragging tool? Like when you say like a weapons convention or something like that, is it mostly like if someone buys a bunch of nukes and then they have a bunch of nukes, is it just the idea like, oh, that person has a bunch of nukes? Like it's not really going to be used, but it's more of a sense of like, yeah, I own all these nukes. It's kind of like when you see the military generals, they have like a bunch of blocks or something on their it's like that. When the dude has it to where he can't look down because it's hitting him in the face, like it's a bragging in a sense, and that's kind of what I look at the nukes at now is like
I mean,
not really an
just to be fair, that
expectation.
the Russians wouldn't be selling the missiles, not the actual war, like the nuclear part, because they're not going to. Countries are actually very careful about not selling nuclear materials because they don't want it to blow back on them, and there's all sorts of international treaties and everything. And they sell the missiles though to countries. That's a lot of people do.
Okay, so wait, hold on. You just gave me an interesting thought. Now, could a lot of like deterrence from nuclear threat or nuclear war also be an aspect of what other countries would be involved that you're going to impact, not just with that one? Like if someone wants to launch a nuke at the US, now if the US has treaties with the UK, Canada, and all these other things, they don't want that to go back to them. So then it's like instead of just attacking one country, they'd be attacking multiple in a sense because they're all interconnected. So if you have a bunch of lines, it's like kind of trying to walk through like on a tightrope. But imagine if there's a million tight ropes crossing over each other. You're trying to like figure out a way to get through it without hitting any of them. And it just becomes a deterrence in a way where you just back off saying there's not even a point in using that. We might as well try something else.
Yeah, and I mean, well, the point of NATO, for instance, right, is that the core of NATO is an attack on one is an attack on all. Article 5 of the NATO treaty. So that's why Putin wouldn't attack. You think, oh well, he can just attack Poland, but you attack Poland, you're attacking the United States essentially, and so that's why Poland's in a better situation than why Ukraine wanted to be in NATO, why Putin didn't want Ukraine to be in NATO, right? So because that comes with something real, a real commitment that means something.
Have you ever had any ideas just investigating and like working with this for so long? Have you ever had any ideas of things that maybe you could do to be able to, I guess, do your job more effectively? I'm not saying you're not doing it properly now. I'm just saying just be able like maybe like I get inspirations at work all the time that I toss out and they usually don't listen to it. I'm just curious if you ever had your own thoughts and maybe things you could be doing more effectively or maybe things that you would like to implement.
Well, that's what we were paid for essentially. And when you're at a think tank, I mean, that's our job is to come up with new ideas or, I mean, look at certain situations, but often trying to come up with innovations about how to approach things. So,
That's true, but Shark Tank, they don't buy every sales pitch.
well, we have to sell it. We have customers too. They just happen to be governments and, someone has to pay for your research. And so often that's government, sometimes it's foundations, but they're the kind of the Shark Tank judges essentially for what you're trying to sell.
Do they ever look at more sustainable options or more like kind of peaceful options, or does it always have to be sale? Like I just picture you have to like, this is awesome, affordable, like really like community building and like this type of thing that we could use with nuclear power, but you have to place like a warhead in front of it so they see that and it attracts them to your booth, and then you grab that. Like is it like
Yeah,
that?
no, I mean not. I mean we're on the peaceful end. Actually, we're trying to like, how do you have a negotiation? How do you have an
Yeah.
agreement? There's because we're not a defense contractor. I mean, defense contractors would probably be doing that other end of things. I mean, the Lockheed Martins of the world and others are, they're kind of telling people, okay, we can hit this thing that's going to knock out the guy. Here's our javelin missiles or whatever it is. We're going to take out your enemy.
How do most negotiations go?
Well, most of them don't lead anywhere, unfortunately, but some do. So, I mean, I guess I'm not sure, it takes the ones that succeed take a long time and are very difficult,
I just picture
and they're narrow, they tend to be, you only can sort of a narrow things that you can get agreement. You're not going to solve all the problems. You can take discrete things and try to solve them, or at least hold off, have something that works for some time period, but then the world changes, and so you have to adjust.
Yeah, I know we see a lot of like broadcasting of like people like foreign ministers meeting with other foreign ministers and all these types of things that go on. But I always just wonder if that's like just for show, and what they really do is like go to a strip club and just have like I gotta think that they touch base on like a more realistic level. Like it's very, very hard when I see things on the media and it's all through camera, like you see Biden waving or you're seeing whatever. I don't trust that, because I'm like, if this is how they're really doing it, it just seems like more of a pony show. I rather see like, are they working? Like, is this all for show and they're really doing the actual stuff in the background? Like, are they doing like sitting down, having a whiskey? Like, if you ever see the new season of Space Force, he meets with the main guy in China space program or whatever, and they sit and have a whiskey together. And like they're talking about actual things and trying to settle, like you get half the moon, we get half the moon, whatever this type of thing is. I picture that going on rather than this aspect of like we see them shake hands. And then like we had the what is it? I don't remember if it was China, the guy over here that met with Biden, and they said, "Oh, negotiations went well." Then you find out it didn't go well at all. Like I'm just curious, is this a factor of cameras? And I know the general public has to be informed on a lot of these issues as well too. I mean, I'm doing the same thing in a sense. I'm really just trying to get your perspective on things, mostly to educate myself, especially when it comes to energy and all that. But is would it be better if we didn't have the cameras showing that? Like if we just had transcripts or something of letting people know this is how it went? Because I feel like putting on a smile, whether you like this person or not, it's kind of like when you watch like the United Nations, like not everybody likes each other. They had what is it, Yeomi Park, the North Korean defector. They had her sit right next to the people from North Korea, and she was like, "I thought I was gonna die," because they're not paying attention to that. They just want everybody to smile and show good on screen. Where I feel like that's where a large step of the miscommunication comes from that we could probably change.
Well, I mean, I think, realistic diplomatic negotiations don't take place in public. That's just to show, as you said, a lot of it is kind of, one, to tell the public they are meeting, and that's important. There's important to know that people at least are trying to work on these issues and engaging. But if you're going to make progress, you don't do it in public. I mean, that's behind closed doors, and people have more candid discussions then. And it depends on the issues. Right now, if we were trying to talk to the Russians, we wouldn't have very useful discussions because there's too much anger and there's no goodwill to try to make a deal. And, so it's depends on the situation. And you have, sometimes you just need a process that has to kind of continue, even if it's not making progress, because there's an importance to just having regularity and diplomatic interchanges and so on. But real things do happen behind closed doors. And then we end up, I don't know, think about like the peace accord that ended the Bosnia war. That was real. Eventually there was a peace agreement, and there was a war that ended, so things do happen. You're not going to be there in the room when it happens if you're not a government official.
How did you get involved in this topic?
Um,
I just can't picture you waking up being like, I want to
yeah,
get
no,
nuclear weapon conflicts going on in my head.
I was involved I was a diplomat, and then I was a foreign policy journalist in Washington, and I ended up editing a magazine / journal called Arms Control Today. And that's when I kind of really learned the specifics. And then I was there for 6 years, and then I moved to my current institute. So I've been doing that for 13 years now.
Now, with foreign policy, what particularly interests you in foreign policy? Is it with the nuke stuff? It can't be with the nuke stuff. It's got to be with like just better relationships, right?
Politics. It's interesting just to see how countries interact and what, different cultures and history and all that, kind of stuff.
Is it the best that we could be doing, or do you have some tips?
I think, look, I don't know all the answers, so I mean, we try, people
That's why I
try,
trust you, because you're honest like that. You're gonna give me that answer. I like
I've,
that.
we have, there's a lot of good professional diplomats out there. The usual problems are actually less among those people, and everyone's got politics in their own country, right? And you know how it is here. We have fights between the parties, and how do you deal with that, and how do you get people to accept unpleasant truths a lot of time. A lot of times you have to compromise on things that people don't want to compromise in their domestic politics. All the politicians want to tell you, well, we can, get everything for nothing, but you're dealing with other countries' interests and needs too, and that's difficult. So it's always a balancing act.
Do you think that a lot of this could probably be solved if we just spent more time regulating ourselves rather than regulating other countries? I know everyone brings that up, like the US is involved in so much stuff, but I even bring it back to the energy thing. Like, if you look at like some of the stuff on the energy.gov, their biggest, like, oh, we can't do wind water power because it costs all this money to make dams, and go, we saw this over in China. It's like, wait, hold on a second. Those are two different climates. Why are you analyzing China's problems compared to ours? Like, it's going to be different per region. Where I just start looking at, like, it seems like even with states, they got other states that are worried about other governors. I mean, you got fast food places talking trash on Twitter to each other. Then you got vaccine people talking trash to each other on Twitter, the CEOs of the businesses. Then you got the states talking trash on the other governors, where I'm just like, can everyone worry about their own place? Like, that's not a crazy idea, but I feel like that's a lot of sense as well too. And whenever I talk to someone who's like into the woke politics, like I want to have a conversation. I'm glad you're having a conversation with me. Some people don't want that conversation. Some people hear you say something, they want to chop your dick off and throw it in the trash can. And I'm like, all right, hang on a second. I just have questions. But they always say, like, we need to worry about ourselves. In a sense, they're right, but also I don't know what the better regulation is too. I think you need to understand, like, for instance, dealing with Russia or dealing with China. People are surprised that China's like dealing with Russia, or we're pushing China into the arms of Russia or something. I'm like, well, they have the same kind of like idea of like how they want to run their countries, one effective leader and one kind of totalitarian sense. Now, I'm sure we'd love to do that here, but we kind of built upon free speech and all this other types of fun stuff that people use against other people to make their lives miserable in hell. Um, so you can't do that type of stuff. So I'm just trying to, I understand I think we need to get our own country in balance when it comes to just the general public. I don't know how that ever gets solved. Maybe it's the climate thing. I don't know. But I also look at it like, it's maybe I have the dumb perspective that we're just a human species, and that's why I get so interested in the alien stuff. I mean, if you figure out aliens come here, then everyone's going to team up and go against that. But that's a very rare little occurrence thing. So I'm trying to look at like not just foreign policy on an aspect of getting together with other nations or other countries and having a civil talk and discussion and being able to run effectively both of their countries. Because, man, the only reason people do deals, the only reason people do something, even that comes with people to people, is if they can get something for themselves. I mean, the dumbest thing I've done in my life is start a show where I'm not asking you, like, I can't give you 1 million followers. I can't do all these type of stuff. But what I'm giving you is a conversation where I'm generally here. And that's the best I can offer. And for a lot of people who take that, like yourself, that that's awesome. But for most of the people, a lot of people want your viewers, they want this, they want that. And I think that's an ego thing in us all. And that's what I relate to with these nations up there. That's the only thing I can speak about because, like I said, I can't dive into each individual's countries or I'll go mad. It's just you can't, because people put their own personal experiences in someone else's thing. Like, oh, they're running it over there like this. It's like, yeah, but we have a different scenario over here. Like, we can't do what Canada does. Canada can talk trash on us. We can talk trash on Canada. But overall, you got to focus on your own stuff as well too. And it's so hard because people don't want to get involved into something that doesn't benefit their own lives. And I also think that also leads to a lot of destruction of other things as well too. People can't attach a name to a face if it's talking about that's going to ruin future generations. Yeah, but they're going to make money now and they don't know those hypothetical people you're bringing up. That's the thing, is like trying to keep that in your head, how to have that balancing act while on top of managing a country and war and all this type of stuff. I was like, even with the pandemic, people gave a lot of shit to either person. I did too. But at the same time, you got to understand going through that is hell. And nobody was ready for that. So it's like stepping on the minefield. It's like being Elvis. He was the first person to get fame. He stepped in every pothole. Everyone can just watch what he did and not do that. This is like the first pandemic in a long time. You, to say we could have done it worse, sure. Could we say we could have done it better? Sure. But overall, it's just hell in general around the board.
Yeah, well, yeah, people. It's easy to Monday morning quarterback, right? I mean, it's very
Mhm.
hard to be in those positions, and things are flying at you, and you're trying to deal with it. So, I think the thing that in terms of domestic politics, one sort of nice thing about the Ukraine thing has been it's been relatively bipartisan, which has been a nice change from the last few years. And I've sort of been in Washington for long enough that I recall when that was more typical, and that's really fallen apart, and that's been sad. That's been bad for the country because I think it's not good for us to go from one extreme to the other and veer back and forth. And it's the stronger and more united we are as a country, the better we are placed in the world. And the same thing with our allies. The more we're together, the more influence we have, and the more we kind of fight amongst ourselves, the worse off we are. So I
Yeah,
would say that's somewhere where we could really do some work. Yeah.
it's crazy because I remember not even like a couple of years ago they were talking about Ukraine and they were bad mouthing Ukraine, and then it's weird to see how everyone kind of flipped the narrative. Not people, but like just the media in general, kind of switched over to like we care and we stand for you, and it's like it was weird to see that transparency, but I don't think anybody really paid attention to it a whole lot who wasn't already focused in on like the issue in general. It seemed like the general public kind of was just like, oh, now we're more alert. Now let's all change our profile pictures. I mean, that's cool, but at the same time, it's like, are we doing anything to help? And people go, well, we can accept people to come over here. Now, I worked at hotels. We had people that were from Ukraine, Bosnia, all these places that would come there. So I feel for those people over there as well too. But we're not the only person that can do something as well too. I mean, this is a global thing that needs to take up, and I think that's what we need to get into our heads. A lot of people blame their own country for not doing more. It's like, yeah, but everyone can kind of play a part in a sense too. If we talk about the grand scale of the world, we're not running together, and most people well, go back to the States. We're also not running together either. Everyone's on their own little track, but they're all worried about other people's problems. It should be the opposite way around. You should be worrying about your own problems and also being able to help out if you need to. But maybe I don't know. I'm like I said, I'm way out of that
Right. I'd
view
say
of
in this
that.
case, I mean, to be fair, our European allies have really been out front on helping people here. I mean, the polls are, I don't know, 2 million people they've taken, 3 million.
That's good.
Romania and all these other European countries have been very good in terms of taking refugees and so on. And we're helping them some, and we should, but they've really been kind of taking the lead.
Do you,
So,
do you think this was because the pandemic seemed like everyone was on halt for 2 years? Everybody got a little bit. It's like kind of like if you don't like treat yourself to something, you eventually like end up splurging or binging. Like if you do a strict diet for 8 months and then someone brings over a Domino's pizza, you're gonna lose your mind. So is this like that? Is this just like he's been waiting to do this, or did something trigger this that brought it to a point? Because it seemed like it was just out of nowhere for a lot of the general public, like myself. I didn't.
you mean for Putin? Why did he do it then?
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't claim to be a psychologist, so you'd really have to know, or a Russia expert in that sense. I mean, one possibility, I mean, there's a couple of things. One is that I think he thought he read the Afghanistan situation wrong and thought that that showed the administration wasn't that intent on standing up for things, or there was more disunity in the alliance than there was, and that he'd be about, wouldn't get a lot of blowback if he invaded Ukraine. Um, but I think, and also I think he thought trends in Ukraine were kind of running against him in the long term, and that, for instance, we and other countries were supplying them with military aid. Their military, clearly, as we've seen, has become much more capable, and he thought if that trend continued, if he was going to ever do anything, he kind of had to do it now before it became more difficult. And then he's also, he's looking at his succession, at his legacy, and he wanted to sort of do this, I think, before, either he stopped out of leadership or he died, or, it's kind of, this stuff has been burning him, in terms of Russia's place in the world, I think for 20 years. I mean, he's had statements going back to when he took office about how, NATO expansion was unfair, and how the end of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe. And so he's, the closest historic analogy I can make is sort of Germany after the First World War, where there was this kind of notion of the stab in the back, and we've got to make up for what we lost. And a lot of this stuff is very similar, I think, coming from Putin. So that's sort of been the long-term thing. Why it happened particularly now is, that's my guess, is some of these factors, but
There's a
you
picture of
really
him
don't
there.
know.
Picture him holding like a whiskey or a vodka and just like, it's time. Just fucking running into that shit. There's a superhero show on Netflix, and they talk about this. Like when one of the superheroes dies, everybody's like, it's Putin, and he's got his finger on the button about to hit the nuke thing. I'm like, that's too soon, dude. Like maybe the show was recorded way before that idea, because everyone's kind of joked about like Russia has nuclear weapons. Then we find out they have more than what we thought. That was crazy. Is that real? Is that true? Or did I read a disinformation article?
No, they don't. They don't. I think we have a pretty good sense of how many weapons they have.
I thought before we were like, oh, they have a couple. We thought America had more, but then they found out that Russia might have more.
Well, we have. Um, there are different kinds of nuclear weapons. There's what are called strategic weapons, which are the ICBMs, the submarine launch weapons, the long range weapons, where we can hit Russia from the United States, and the Russians can hit us from Russia. And we're pretty equal on those. The Russians have many more, and we've known this, of what are called non-strategic weapons. Those are shorter range systems. And that's because they've never been controlled by an arms control treaty, unlike the strategic weapons. And so those become more important if you're talking about fighting in Europe, because obviously Russia's in Europe and we're not, right? So we've got some of our own systems that are deployed in allied countries, but they're far fewer than the Russian systems. So people worry about that disparity in numbers. But that's actually something I spend a fair amount of time on, that issue. But it's
Are there a lot of black lines like that throughout, like certain weapons that aren't under treaties that maybe we can find a way to be able to work in like an agreement on that? Like I'm sure that you're not gonna be able to cover everything. Every contract has a loophole. Every something has whatever. You can ask any divorce lawyer; they'll be able to find it for you. But when it comes to like an overall agreement on weapons in general, do you think that eventually, depending on how long it'll take, that you'll have every single one being able to be kind of written in a policy or some type of agreement on it? Because I feel like there's still a lot there, like when it comes to black lines on stuff.
Well, I mean, that's one of the goals of the Biden administration. So the big strategic arms treaty, which is called New START now, New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, which Obama and his team negotiated, and was ran for 10 years, and then was just extended by Biden and Putin soon after Biden got into office until 2026. The new negotiation that was starting to take place, or was about to take place before Ukraine, was to come up with a treaty that would replace that eventually before 2026. And the US administration came in there and said, we want to cover all the nuclear warheads, no matter what kind of system they're on. So that's the US position. The Russians have kind of resisted, which is not surprising, because they've got this huge advantage in this number of these non-strategic warheads. So you have to come up with a strategy to engage that, and that's part of the thing people talk about. But I think eventually that's going to happen, partially because we have technology now that can. It was much harder to verify those systems beforehand. We and other people have come up with some approaches that could make that much more feasible. So that's kind of where you are in the process. But that's all been suspended because of Ukraine, because we're not talking to them about these things since that happened.
And if something like that did get deployed, would there be some type of defense system that would be able to stop it?
Um, no system is going to be able to stop these things entirely. I mean, there's missile defense systems that can stop some of the, knock down some systems, but it only takes one to make, a really bad impact. And especially the strategic systems that, I mean, our missile defenses aren't intended to, because the Russians just have so many weapons. I mean, they've got thousands of them, that our missile defenses are really intended to, knock down maybe a North Korean missile or one that goes off by accident or something like that. I mean, if you're lucky. And you have to have several interceptors to hit one missile and so on. And then if the Russians use these things like these hypersonics, which are intended to avoid missile defenses, then you may not hit them at all. So, basically our nuclear deterrent and prevention of nuclear war still rests on, MAD, mutually assured destruction. I mean, it rests on the idea that if the Russians hit us with a nuclear weapon, we're going to retaliate with a nuclear weapon. So they're not going to launch a nuclear weapon in the first place.
Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
That's fucking intense, man. I hate this. I'm sorry. That's just thinking about that though. I know mutually just that's so flimsy. That is so flimsy. And it's flimsy, but it's effective. Because it's like you don't want to get blown up back, but it's like, oh damn it. Because every time you see a movie where someone launches a nuke, like once they launch the nuke, all our nukes are firing. They start going off and flying in the air. Then they just hit a button and they explode in the air. Like, oh, I guess we're not doing it anymore. It's like, what happened to the flock of fucking seagulls that died because of that, or the 747 that was involved? But it just makes it like they don't ever explain. I'm like, it's not like that though. That's not realistic, because if something did have that, it's going to have impact. It's going to damage somewhere. And that's the issue, is like even you said accidentally going off. That's a fear too. I mean, even being around those things, if you're not thinking like checking yourself every single day at the doctor when you get done for a lump under your testicle, just because you're being around the thing, I would be afraid in general. But when it comes to arms conflict, what you write for, do you have a lot of material to be able to keep writing every single day about these types of things? Or do you just hit certain giant topics like big agreements? Because it seems like a lot of people, especially around, like I said, the war and everything that's going on right now, they're probably getting a lot of questions on that as well too. And
sure.
maybe you might get some sprinkled in with Korea, just because, yeah.
Well, I mean, we, at think tanks, you tend to focus on long-term research projects on certain areas. And then, if someone wants to talk to you or they ask for an article on specific things, then you write it. But we're not journalists. I mean, we're not writing, an article every day necessarily on something. Our thing is really trying to come up with new takes or new information on certain parts of the puzzle, and different people attack different parts of the puzzle.
And I'm sure there's probably stuff you can't talk about too, right?
Yeah.
Okay, just check. Just making sure. I like I said, I barely know anything about the weapon thing. I mean, the environment thing or energy thing is like the main thing I reached out to for. But it was I mean, you have a very, very rational perspective, I would say, when it comes to these types of things too. Like, you're not super freaked out like most people would be if they're dealing with something like this, or when most people talk about this topic, but you also have a concern for it as well too, which I think is what's needed. I think that's important in anything. You need to come at it with like a skeptical type thing, but also with a more kind of like not so cynical when it comes to, yeah, it's a dangerous topic, but doesn't mean it needs to ruin your life, and you don't need to freak people out like that's all you see on media. It's just that's the thing.
Well, that's how you get it. That's how you get readers or eyeballs or whatever. You don't get it. It's all it's a crowded universe out there of media and information. And so how do you get people to pick your article through that thicket of things, right? They tends to make it even more dramatic, I think, than it used to be, because there's just so much out there these days.
Just go on the Jerry Springer show and hash it out. That's all I gotta say. Miles, it's been a pleasure chatting with you, man. Seriously, I really appreciate you doing the podcast.
Sure.
Is there
That's
a place?
my pleasure too.
well, sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. You're about to give me a compliment. Damn it. But Miles, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Is there a place where people can find you, your Twitter handle? I know you have a Twitter. I'm pretty sure I follow you.
Yeah, it's ad Miles Pomper at Twitter, MILDS POMPER, and my organization is called the James Martin Center for Nonproliferation Studies, and I think their Twitter handle's CNS Updates, which is kind of our acronym CNS.
Why don't you just say it by the Twitter thing, CNS? Like when I introduced that topic, I would just be like, I work for CNS. But if you got to say that whole thing, like imagine you're at like career day at school and like, so this is what my dad does. And then you just ladders it off. You have a bunch of people like, what?
So, did you ever see that? What was it, the Billy Crystal movie where he's like they do that career day and then he's like he sells like airtime at a radio station and some other guy comes in and he's like does something very like manual and visible and he sort of his kid is really embarrassed because they have no idea what he's it's not very cool.
I haven't seen it, but I can picture that. That's hilarious. Miles, it's been a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks again. I'm gonna link everything in the description. Thanks everybody for listening to this episode. By the blank.